Hey everyone, James from TDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today is going to be a non-drinking Inbetweenisode that might touch on a little bit of a controversial topic. Probably not for people that have been following for a long time, but it will have a little bit of a provocative title about why you should not buy Chinese tea locally. Buying local is often seen as sort of a virtue in contemporary society. We have like farmers markets here in the US and stuff like that, where you support like local farms, local businesses. I'm not commenting on that trend locally. I'm more commenting on this specifically through the lens of tea and specifically as a tea hobbyist, and why it's generally not a good idea to be buying tea, locally from like a farmer's market or something like that, or a local vendor. If you're in a town with one tea shop, you'd probably be better off going online and buying tea rather than, going to the local shop or something like that. Even as in a city like Seattle, which is, which is where I live, and is a place that's fairly diverse, has a pretty strong Asian American, specifically Chinese American population. The Chinese tea shops here, there are some good ones for sure, but I think even then, if I were to give the advice to someone just getting started, I'd certainly be recommending primarily online options for tea, unless they were interested in something that I think is particularly good locally. So hopefully I don't annoy those vendors too much, because I am a fan of a couple of them. But it is what it is. I just generally think it is a good idea to be looking online, and I think it's a good example of kind of how the world has shrunk in terms of like imported globalization in a good way that opens up access to a lot of avenues and different hobbies that people may not have previously had as easy of access to. And I think the main reason why you do not want to buy Chinese tea locally, just as kind of a best practice, is because this is a specialty imported product. This is not something other than kind of a little bit of oddities here and there of teas that's like grown in Hawaii or Washington State, which are fine to try. But if you're really just trying to get a feel and understanding of what tea is, you absolutely have to buy tea that is grown and processed in China, and so that's just a fact of the matter. So even your local tea shop is importing those teas and stuff like that. So in my view, there's not a huge difference between buying from them versus buying a product from someone like Yunnan Sourcing, who has the tea in China and is importing it to you. I also want to say that this advice is given rather generally. I know there is going to be a bunch of people that are commenting below or something like that are like, but I had such a great experience locally and stuff like that. I'm not saying it's impossible to get a good experience locally where you're buying tea that you're satisfied with and stuff like that. I'm just saying that it is much more challenging, and usually you're a little bit worse off if you did that versus if you put in a little bit of time and research into a couple of good vendors of the teas that you're interested in and bought your tea online. Another thing to comment on too is the West is just not a hotspot for Chinese tea, neither in growing nor appreciation. It's just not. Even in Seattle, as I said, which does have a strong Chinese immigrant population here, you're not going to be finding Chinese tea enthusiasts down the street that much. We do have a handful of tea shops that are, there are some that are quite good. But even then, it's not a hotspot for that. I am a Chinese American tea lover myself, and there's just not that many of us. This is still predominantly a coffee city, and that is true for most of the West and stuff like that. So even if you're new to tea and you were lucky enough to pick out Floating Leaves, good vendor, specifically focused on Taiwanese oolong, Crimson Lotus, good vendor, also focused on Pu'erh. Even if you were to pick out those two, which would be very, very challenging for a newcomer to tea, and you have good experiences there, I would still say that you should try out buying online and trying a couple different vendors too, even if it's just to give you kind of different experiences. And the odds of a new drinker discovering those two places immediately, as far as like just when they're Googling local tea shops, they're very, very slim to none odds. Online both expands your options and the different experiences that you can have. So yeah, you'd have to get extremely, extremely lucky to it. One thing that I will note is that one of the very common teas, but this happens to all teas really, that you'll hear described as like, why don't I like Pu'erh? And almost always it will be someone that bought kind of like the first Pu'erh they found, which is Pu'erh from, yes, not a specialist, probably from a grocery store or something like that, that is just not very good. And so many oftentimes it's just like, it's not you that doesn't like Pu'erh necessarily, although of course you could still dislike it, but it's rather the Pu'erh itself that is bad and is giving you that experience and stuff like that. One thing that you'll definitely notice if you're in the tea sort of world, tea hobbyist world for a while, is that things tend to get more specialized. Vendors specialize. Hobbyists also specialize. There are usually 2 or 3 categories of tea that you're going to be drinking. For instance, I am a person that drinks a lot of Pu'erh, and I drink specific types of Pu'erh within there, and there are some that I drink less often than others. So like young Pu'erh, don't drink that so much. I drink a lot of Pu'erh that's like around 15 years old or so. I drink a lot of Wu Oolong. I don't drink a lot of Dansang Oolong. Don't drink a lot of green tea. So everyone kind of has these certain teas that you're just going to naturally, inherently gravitate towards and like more. And it makes sense that you're going to sort of specialize in that. Chinese tea is incredibly diverse and broad. And there's all kinds of categories. There's subcategories within those categories, things like that. Vendors are definitely going to be specialized too. And there are certain vendors that you would trust for certain categories of teas and less so for others. I mean, no offense to white tea, but I'm not looking to white tea to buy green tea necessarily. You might occasionally run across a green tea that's good. That's possible. But for the most part, you are looking at a vendor like white tea for their freshly pressed, like within the last 4 or 5 years, young Pu'erh that they're pressing and doing themselves. That is what they focus on. That's what they specialize in too. The reason why I bring this up is that online allows you to focus also on the specific specialists of teas that you like. And that's probably, if you continue on your tea trajectory, that's probably where you'd end up anyways. Rather than kind of just more general approach and stuff like that. So online really gives you that space. It's absurd to think that like a Wu Oolong vendor could open up in like a local tea shop here in Seattle and focus on just selling locally. Whereas like online you have vendors based in China, or like Old Ways Tea is based in San Francisco, but has connections to a family over there. So they are focused on selling online. Of course, you can have sort of these hybrids that are online, but also sell locally and stuff like that. Things like Floating Leaves, and those could also work in those sense too. So tea is just an incredibly varied product, and eventually you're going to gravitate towards those specialists. So why not do that a little bit sooner? And I think the biggest thing that you can do that's like really a setback if you do buy locally is you can buy a tea that's just not good enough, and it will give you a bad experience, and it will give you a bad impression of a certain type of tea, and you might not think you'll like that tea. And that might just not be the case, where you might actually like that tea. You might like good ripe Pu'erh, but if you had like shitty ripe Pu'erh from a place, then yeah, you're gonna be under that false impression that it's not good, and that you can certainly have that impression for tea beyond ripe too. Like if you're just buying from a local tea shop and maybe they just don't happen to have good Dansang Oolong, you might just read into that too much, and like maybe it's 4 or 5 years before you actually try a Dansang. You're like, wait a second, it might be actually a little bit more something to this. So again, this advice is meant to be just kind of taken more generally to someone that's just looking to get into tea. What I would recommend for someone just getting started is to kind of read up, spend a little bit of time. You don't have to spend a lot of time. Research the types of tea that you think are most interesting, and try to figure out which ones are the specialists online and order some samples from them. I think you'll generally be much better off doing it that way rather than kind of going into your local very generalist tea vendor, which I think are the majority of tea shops here in the US these days, and kind of trying those teas. It might work out in the end if you buy local, but I do think like your batting average, your chance of success is so much higher if you are willing to put in the time and the research and to do that. So that is my advice, to not buy local, but look online, buy from vendors that are based in China. I don't think there's any reason to necessarily buy domestic either. You can, obviously there are, it gets a little bit more complicated with shipping costs and whatnot. But generally speaking, I think there are a lot of excellent vendors that are based in China, Taiwan, Malaysia, a little bit less so, that are Western facing. But point being that there are vendors that are based close to the source, that I think it's just generally better to order from them rather than buying someone that has imported the tea already and locally. All right. Well, let me know how you like this episode. Let me know if you flagrantly disagree with everything I said. Obviously, I don't mean that it's impossible to have a good local tea experience. I have had many, but I do think that, looking online and stuff like that is something, generally speaking, that I will recommend to someone that is just getting started. So thank you all for tuning in. I will see you all next time.